Number 1, opium, the joy plant. It's roughly 3400 BC in ancient Sumer, modern-day Iraq, and the Sumerians have just discovered something extraordinary. They've been cultivating a flower, the poppy, and they figured out that if you slice open the seed pod and collect the milky sap that oozes out, you get a substance that makes pain disappear and fills you with a warm, dreamy euphoria. They call it hul gil, the joy plant. And with that, humanity's longest and most complicated relationship with a drug begins. The Sumerians didn't keep this discovery to themselves. They passed their knowledge of opium to the Assyrians, who passed it to the Babylonians, who passed it to the Egyptians. By 1300 BC, opium was being mass-produced in the poppy fields of Egypt and traded across the entire ancient world. And everybody loved it. Egyptian mothers rubbed opium paste on their babies' gums to stop them crying. Which, it definitely worked. Egyptian doctors prescribed it for headaches, surgery, insomnia, depression. They ground it into paste, mixed it into drinks, and shaped it into suppositories. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, contains over 700 remedies, and opium shows up in a shocking number of them. When the Greeks got hold of it, they ran with it. Soldiers took it before battle to dull the fear of death. Homer mentions it in the Odyssey. Helen of Troy drops a drug into wine that quieted all pain and strife and brought forgetfulness of every ill. Most scholars believe she was spiking the wine with opium. The Greek god of sleep, Hypnos, was depicted holding poppies. The god of dreams, Morpheus, whose name we literally get the word morphine from, was surrounded by them. And then the Romans. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most celebrated philosophers in human history, took opium every single day. His personal physician Galen prescribed it, and Marcus spent his evenings writing some of the most profound philosophical texts ever produced, while absolutely zonked on opiates. His Meditations, a book still assigned in university courses today, was written by a man who was probably high while writing it, which honestly explains why some of it reads the way it does. The remarkable thing is that for roughly 4,000 years, nobody considered opium a problem. There was no concept of addiction, no moral panic, no war on drugs. It was just medicine. Good medicine that made you feel incredible. It took until the 19th century for anyone to seriously start asking whether a substance that makes you feel like a god every time you take it might have some downsides. Number 2, Blue Lotus, the party drug of the Pharaohs. It's around 1500 BC in ancient Egypt, and the elite are throwing a party. But they're not drinking regular wine. They've taken the petals of a beautiful blue water lily, Nymphea caerulea, commonly known as the blue lotus, and soaked them in wine for several hours. The result is a drink that acts as a sedative, an aphrodisiac, and a mild hallucinogen, all at the same time. It's ancient Egypt's version of a cocktail that does everything. Blue lotus was everywhere in Egyptian culture, and I mean everywhere. Painted on tomb walls, carved into temple pillars, depicted in banquet scenes, shown being held up to people's noses at parties. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, they found dried blue lotus petals scattered across his body. This wasn't some obscure recreational drug. This was a central part of Egyptian social and religious life. The effects are interesting from a pharmacological standpoint. The flower contains two main psychoactive compounds. Nuciferine is a sedative that produces a calm, floating sensation. Apomorphine activates dopamine receptors, creating euphoria and heightened sensual awareness. Combined with alcohol, the result is a warm, dreamy, mildly psychedelic state that the Egyptians associated with divine connection. Priests used it in religious ceremonies, claiming it allowed them to communicate with the gods. And given what we now know about its pharmacology, they were probably having some genuinely interesting experiences. Cleopatra, according to some accounts, bathed in pools infused with it. Whether that's actually true or just the kind of story that gets attached to someone like Cleopatra is hard to say. But it fits. And here's the part that might surprise you. Blue Lotus is still completely legal in most countries today. You can buy it online, you can brew it into tea. Nobody seriously regulates it because it's technically just a flower. The ancient Egyptians' favorite party drug ships in 2 days. Welcome to the future. Number 3, Cannabis, the god smoke. It's 2700 BC in ancient China, and Emperor Shen Nung is compiling what will become one of the oldest medical texts in human history. Cannabis is in it, listed as a treatment for rheumatism, malaria, and gout. Not exotic, not dangerous. Just medicine. Practical, effective medicine that a physician was comfortable recommending to an emperor. Fast forward to 440 BC. The Greek historian Herodotus is documenting the Scythians, nomadic warriors who dominated the Eurasian steppes, and he describes something remarkable. After a burial, the Scythians erect small felt tents over iron pots filled with red-hot stones. They seal themselves inside and throw cannabis onto the stones. His description of what happens next: the Scythians howl with joy, awed and elated by the vapor. For a long time, some scholars dismissed this as Herodotus embellishing. He had a reputation for that. Then, in 2019, archaeologists excavated the Jirzhankal Cemetery in western China and tested 2,500-year-old braziers found in the burial sites. The residue contained high THC cannabis. Herodotus had been reporting exactly what he saw. Meanwhile, in India, cannabis had an entirely different identity. Bhang, a drink made from cannabis leaves and milk, was tied to the god Shiva. The Vedas, among the oldest religious texts on earth, list cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants. Bhang is still consumed openly at Hindu festivals today. Nobody there considers it strange or new. It has been going on for thousands of years. Here's what puts all of this in perspective. Cannabis has been medicine, ritual tool, and spiritual sacrament across China, Central Asia, and India for at least 5,000 years. 3 separate continents, 3 completely different cultural contexts, all reaching the same plant independently. The 20th century idea that it's a dangerous, illicit substance would have made absolutely no sense to almost anyone in human history before about 1930. Number 4, Coca, the divine leaf. 8,000 years ago in northern Peru, people are chewing a leaf with a small piece of lime. The combination releases alkaloids into the bloodstream. Hunger fades, altitude sickness lifts, exhaustion slows. Nothing about this looks like a religious ceremony. It looks like someone who figured out how to make a very hard life slightly more manageable. By the time the Inca Empire was at its height, coca had become something much larger. The Inca considered it sacred, a direct gift from the gods. It was burned in religious ceremonies and offered to the sun. Laborers building Machu Picchu and the 25,000-mile Inca road system were given daily coca rations. Without it, working at that altitude at that pace for those years would have been physiologically impossible. Coca wasn't a perk, it was infrastructure. In 1999, 3 child sacrifice mummies were found frozen at 22,000 feet on Mount Lulailaco in Argentina, perfectly preserved by the cold for over 500 years. Chemical analysis of their hair showed they had been given massive, increasing doses of coca in the months before their deaths. These children were being prepared for sacrifice, and coca was woven into that preparation every step of the way. And then, in 1992, something happened that archaeologists still haven't fully resolved. German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova tested 9 Egyptian mummies, ranging from 1070 BC to 395 AD. She found cocaine and nicotine in all of them, every single one. The problem: coca doesn't grow in Egypt. Tobacco doesn't grow in Egypt. Both plants existed only in the Americas, and European contact with the Americas didn't happen until the late 15th century. The findings have been reproduced by other labs using the same methods. Nobody has a clean explanation for how those alkaloids ended up in Egyptian tissue. It remains one of the most contested findings in the history of archaeology. The Spanish, when they arrived in South America, initially banned coca in 1569 and called it the work of the devil. Then they discovered something inconvenient. Miners given coca worked harder, ate less, and complained less at altitude. The same church that had declared it demonic quietly reversed course and started distributing it to the indigenous workers in their silver mines. Moral opposition lasted exactly as long as it was economically convenient. Cocaine wasn't isolated as a compound until 1855. The people of northern Peru had been using its precursor for 8,000 years before that. And somehow, impossibly, traces of it ended up in Egyptian mummies that predate Columbus by over 2,000 years. Number 5, Soma, the mystery drug. Sometime around 1,500 BC in ancient India, Vedic priests are performing their most sacred ritual. At the center of it is a drink called Soma, pressed from a plant, filtered through wool, mixed with milk and honey, consumed by priests who then enter states of divine communion. Soma is mentioned 114 times in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in human history. An entire book of the Rig Veda the ninth mandala, is dedicated exclusively to it. One hymn reads, "We have drunk Soma and become immortal. We have attained the light the gods discovered." This wasn't a drug in any casual sense. This was the centerpiece of an entire civilization's spiritual practice. And here's the problem. Nobody knows what it was. The original plant went extinct, or the knowledge of which plant to use was lost when trade routes shifted. By the time later Hindu texts were written, Soma had already become mythological rather than practical. The priests knew they were supposed to use Soma. They just no longer knew what Soma actually was. This has not stopped people from guessing. In 1968, a banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson published a book arguing that Soma was Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that looks like something out of a Mario game. He argued its psychoactive properties matched the Rig Veda's descriptions of divine visions and feelings of invincibility. Other scholars proposed ephedra, a stimulant plant that grows in the region. Some have suggested cannabis, Syrian rue, or a combination of plants that no longer exist in their original form. The truth is, we may never know. The most important drug in ancient religious history, the substance an entire civilization built their spiritual practice around, and its identity is a complete mystery. Somewhere out there is a plant that made people feel like gods, and we lost it. Number 6, Henbane, the Berserker drug. It's the 9th century somewhere in Scandinavia, and a band of Viking warriors is preparing for battle. Not regular warriors. These men have stripped naked, painted themselves, and are currently biting their own shields while howling like animals. Their eyes are dilated wide. Some of them are foaming at the mouth. They feel no pain. They feel no fear. They are about to charge into an enemy line like rabid wolves, and they cannot wait. These are the Berserkers, the most feared warriors in the Viking world. And there is growing evidence that their legendary battle rage wasn't purely psychological. It was pharmacological. The drug in question, Henbane. Henbane is a deliriant. This distinction matters. Hallucinogens distort reality. Deliriants replace it entirely. Users don't see things differently. They see things that aren't there, and they cannot distinguish them from the real world. The plant contains tropane alkaloids, hyoscyamin, and scopolamine that in the right doses produce uncontrollable rage, total immunity to pain, and the absolute conviction of superhuman strength. In a battle, the conviction and the actual thing are functionally the same. Henbane seeds have been found in Viking graves and at settlement sites. Norse shamans burned the seeds and inhaled the smoke to enter trance states, where they believed they could travel between worlds. Celtic druids reportedly did the same. And here's where it gets interesting. One of Henbane's consistent side effects is a vivid, overwhelming sensation of flying. Users reliably report feeling like they've left the ground and are soaring through the air. Some scholars have connected this directly to the medieval legend of witches on broomsticks. The theory: women accused of witchcraft were applying henbane-based ointments using a staff or stick. The flying sensation became the legend. The broomstick was the delivery mechanism. One weed that grows in ditches may be responsible for both the most feared warriors in medieval Europe and the most enduring image of witchcraft. Not bad. Number 7, Peyote, the God Cactus. In 1957, archaeologists excavating a cave in southwestern Texas called Shumla Cave found something unexpected among the artifacts: small, dried, and chewed cactus buttons. Radiocarbon dating placed them at between 3,780 and 3,660 BC. They were peyote, 5,700 years old, the oldest direct evidence of drug use ever found in the Americas. The people who came after them built an entire cosmology around what was growing in that desert. The Toltecs and Chichimecas were using peyote nearly 2,000 years before the Spanish arrived in Mexico. The Aztecs used it. In Mesoamerican cosmology, peyote didn't belong to humans in any casual sense. It belonged to the gods. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, the word peyotl derives from a root meaning divine messenger. Spanish historian Fray Bernardino de Sahagún documented its use and noted that those who consumed it experienced terrifying or marvelous visions, lasting 2 to 3 days. He was not a fan. The Huichol people of western Mexico took this the furthest. Every year they walk approximately 300 miles to a desert region called Wirikuta. The journey requires weeks of spiritual purification, fasting, abstinence. When they arrive, they hunt the peyote, literally. They treat the first cactus they find as a deer. They shoot arrows into it and make offerings of corn before the harvest begins. The mescaline visions that follow are considered direct messages from the spirit world. The Huichol translate them into art, yarn paintings and beadwork that are essentially visual records of what people saw. The Spanish Inquisition moved to prosecute indigenous people for peyote use in 1620, calling it diabolical trickery. It drove the practice underground for roughly 2 centuries. The practice survived anyway. When suppression eventually lifted, peyote use spread north through the Great Plains of the United States and into Canada. 5,700-year-old chewed cactus buttons from a Texas cave. The people who came after them walked 300 miles a year for the same experience for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition tried to stop them and couldn't. That's how seriously this plant was taken. Number 8. Ayahuasca, the vine of souls. About 1,000 years ago, somewhere in the Bolivian highlands, a shaman is carrying a small pouch made from 3 stitched-together fox snouts. Inside the pouch, researchers would later find traces of at least 5 psychoactive compounds, including DMT and harmine. It's the oldest confirmed ayahuasca preparation ever found. But the plants involved appear in the archaeological record much further back than that. Mummies from the Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished from roughly 300 BC to 1100 AD in what is now Bolivia, have been found with harmine alkaloids in their hair. Harmine comes from the ayahuasca vine. That vine grows only in the Amazon basin. The Tiwanaku lived in the Andes. To get the vine to them, someone had to carry it across some of the most brutal mountain terrain on Earth, with no connecting river systems between the Amazon and the Andean highlands. People were making that trip, regularly, for centuries. Here's the part that's genuinely hard to explain. Ayahuasca requires 2 specific plants to work. The chacruna leaf contains DMT, the most powerful hallucinogen known to chemistry. But DMT taken orally does absolutely nothing. Digestive enzymes in the gut break it down completely before it can reach the brain. The second plant, the Banisteriopsis kykeon vine, contains harmine, a compound that blocks those digestive enzymes and lets the DMT through. Neither plant does anything meaningful on its own. Combined and prepared correctly, they produce 6 to 8 hours of intense visionary experience. Out of roughly 80,000 plant species in the Amazon, indigenous shamans identified the exact 2 plants, where one chemically unlocks the other. Without pharmacology, without a laboratory, thousands of years before anyone understood what a monoamine oxidase inhibitor was. When anthropologists ask how they found this specific combination, shamans from different communities and different languages give the same answer. The plants told us. Modern scientists are now running clinical trials on ayahuasca as a treatment for severe depression and PTSD. The vine that Amazonian shamans have been brewing for at least 1,000 years of documented history is entering psychiatric medicine. They have been ahead of us the whole time. Number 9, ergot, the fungus that built philosophy and burned witches. And finally, we arrive at perhaps the most consequential substance on this list. Not because it was the most widely used, but because its influence may have shaped both the foundation of Western civilization and one of the most infamous events in American history. It's ancient Greece. The most sacred religious ceremony in the Western world is about to begin. Every year for nearly 2,000 years, thousands of people traveled to the town of Eleusis, near Athens, to participate in the Eleusinian Mysteries. The ceremony was protected by law. Revealing what happened inside was punishable by death. Participants drank a beverage called kykeon, barley, water, and mint. Then they entered. The descriptions of what emerged on the other side are consistent across centuries. Participants reported life-altering mystical experiences, a direct encounter with death and rebirth, a complete reorganization of how they understood consciousness and existence. These weren't marginal accounts. This was the reported experience of thousands of educated Greeks over 2 millennia. In 1978, Albert Hofmann, the chemist who had invented LSD 30 years earlier, co-authored a book arguing that kykeon was deliberately spiked with ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grain. It produces lysergic acid, the same base compound as LSD. Hofmann argued the priests at Eleusis had figured out how to extract the psychoactive compounds from ergot while filtering out the toxic ones, creating a controlled psychedelic experience for initiates. The attendee list for the Eleusinian Mysteries was not obscure. Plato participated. Socrates participated. Aristotle participated. Marcus Aurelius participated. All of them sworn to total secrecy on pain of death. All of them describing in their subsequent work a transformed understanding of reality, consciousness, and the nature of existence. If Hofmann's theory is correct, the foundational ideas of Western civilization were shaped, at least in part, by people who had just spent a night on ancient LSD. Now, fast forward to 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. A group of young girls begin having violent seizures, screaming about invisible tormentors, hallucinating demons, contorting their bodies in ways the Puritan community had no framework for. The Salem witch trials begin. 20 people are executed. In 1976, behavioral psychologist Linda Caporal published a paper arguing the girls weren't bewitched. They were suffering from ergot poisoning. The rye crop in Salem that year had been grown in warm, damp conditions, ideal for ergot contamination. The symptoms recorded in the trial documents, convulsions, hallucinations, the sensation of being pricked by invisible pins, the feeling of something crawling under the skin, are a near-perfect clinical match for ergotism. Not everyone agrees. There are legitimate counter-arguments. But the possibility stands. One fungus growing on grain, it may have inspired Plato and killed witches. You cannot make this stuff up.